Though I was several years late to the party, I too fell in love with the thrillingly tense gameplay and incredibly powerful story of The Last of Us. Now, had I played it back in 2013 like the majority, I probably would have questioned the need for another game. But starting the original in late 2019 meant that I knew one had long since been confirmed. And now only a few months later, it's here. So let's talk part 2. It's difficult to review this game without discussing the leaks and the impact they had prior to release. For those unaware, a couple of weeks after the game about a fictional pandemic was delayed indefinitely due to the real-life one, several major cutscenes surfaced online, leading to a sudden new release date only a few weeks after the original May 29th plan. This would ordinarily be a big deal, but it was the backlash that followed that really caused a stir. People were not happy with what they saw in those leaks, and this suddenly went from one of the most anticipated games of the year to one of the most hated. I, however, avoided the leaks the best I could. Maintaining full context is key, and after some very well done marketing in the build up to release date, I popped the disc in and realised that this was the most excited I'd been to start a new game in a long time. But that was then, so now that I finished it, where do I stand? Critics are hailing it as a masterpiece, the user scores would leave you to believe it's a disaster, so it's hard to guess what singular individuals will make of it. So how on earth did I find this game to be? Well, there's a lot I have to say about this one, so without further ado, let's get into this. It's 4 years later and Joel and Ellie have settled into a peaceful life in Jackson. A thriving community blooms, offering a sense of normality only disrupted by their patrolling missions into the infected-ridden environment beyond the walls of the town. New bonds have been formed and all seems well, but everything changes when a cataclysmic event leaves Ellie traumatized, and as Ellie, you'll head into a warring Seattle to inflict revenge on the group behind the tragedy. Needless to say, things don't go simply, ultimately unfolding into the central moral dilemma of vengeance and how it can consume people. An intriguing setup, but how well is the story told? Where do I begin? Well, let's start with one of the biggest controversies that leaked without actually going into it. Now, I assume that what people saw was late game stuff. But one of the big things is actually what sets Ellie off on her quest. It's the call to adventure, the entire driving force of the narrative. And it's a pretty shocking moment, albeit one that was always going to make people angry. Anytime perceptions of established characters are challenged with the writers looking to unravel new flaws in them is always going to divide audiences. I'm open to it though, and I think had it not been leaked, people would have been angered in the right way. It would have put them in sync with Ellie's mindset to go on this trail for revenge, and there are moments for it where I was right there with her, invested in her rage. Okay, so now that I've said my piece on that, how did I find the rest of the story? I liked it. Yeah, I did. Knowing how it all plays out, I don't think it's even close to as effective as the first game, but there were also moments throughout where I really enjoyed the ride. One of my problems with it though is that the new characters aren't that compelling. They're likeable, but they didn't leave an impact the same way the supporting cast did in the first game. I don't think it helps that some of the writing early on felt very melodramatic. During a lot of the normal life stuff, aka the building blocks for the majority of the new cast, the dialogue and delivery of the lines felt less like The Last of Us and more like some awkward TV soap.
What is going on with you?
Mel's pregnant.
It does improve though. There's even a very similar reveal to that one later on that works much better, and you get those wonderful light-hearted interactions that added charm to this bleak setting before. Not as many, mind you, but that's to complement the darker tone. The main menu of the first game was melancholy, but with a sense of hope to it. This one is so darkly mysterious, and that strange foreboding atmosphere of that, and even the loading screen seeps through the entire experience. A strange thing for me to focus on, the starting screen of a game, but I found this one to be an incredibly effective opener. It's felt even throughout those lighter scenes, including those where we get flashbacks to Joel and Ellie in between these two games. They're lovely moments with a sense of looming sadness embedded within them. On that note, I will admit that the story is a little flashback heavy, to the point where I actually said to myself, cut to black, just before the game did just that and went to another flashback. There's even flashbacks within flashbacks, which will please Christopher Nolan, but the sheer number of them does come off as almost comical. I was also a little unsure about how Naughty Dog dealt with their relationship in regard to Joel's decision at the end of the first game, the repercussions of which are very important to the narrative as a whole, as it does take away from some of the ambiguity of the original ending. My interpretation is clearly shown to be not true here, but I do understand why they did it how they did. Ellie's journey is very interesting to see unfold as you progress through her crusade, and it kept me engaged to wherever the story wound up going next. And that's where I feel conflicted with my overall thoughts. For a good chunk of the game, I found the story really entertaining, but what will remain freshest in your mind after experiencing any piece of media is the ending. Now, I don't hate it. I understand what the intent was, and I think with the right build-up behind it, the very last moment could have been quite powerful. But it really made me question the point of an entire third of the experience. If you've played it, you should know exactly which part I'm talking about, but for those who haven't, a kind of spoiler incoming, although the idea is established early on, there's your warning. You play as new character Abby in a massive sidetrack from the main narrative. I get the point that Naughty Dog is trying to get across, and it does tie into something briefly established in the first game.
But whatever it is you think you're going through right now is nothing to what I have been through.
But what happens has no relevance to the rest of the story. You spend a crapload of time learning about characters and events that aren't vital to the climax, and this is a huge chunk of the game we're talking about here. Sure, she goes through some hellish scenarios, and there are memorable scenes with her, but I just didn't find myself that sympathetic to her or any of the other characters there. They're okay, they're just nowhere near as interesting as Ellie, who doesn't have a clue of anything that we as the player experience as Abby. You can easily forget about what happens once you're back controlling Ellie because it doesn't impact much after it's done. Unlike a lot of people, I'm not opposed to the idea of spending time in the shoes of a seemingly villainous character, but all of the thematic ideas in play just don't quite come together satisfyingly enough. They feel a little mismatched. The first game's finale was so moving because it's what the story had been building up to from the very beginning. Every emotion felt throughout beforehand was bottled up to result in as powerful and complete a conclusion as possible. Part 2 feels very messy in that regard. But with that said, I did enjoy a lot of the setup, and there are some interesting discussions to be had here about some of the artistic meanings, but for me, there were too many big detours that set up very little. Jeez, I think that's the longest I've spent talking about a game's story in one of my reviews. You'd be forgiven for getting this is a video game. Well, people kind of did with those leaks, because although certain surprises were spoiled, the art of actually playing the game couldn't be. So while the story doesn't quite reach the same heights of its predecessor, the gameplay absolutely does. It's just as compelling as it was before, if not more so. Not much has changed though, you'll still be scouring the world for resources that are laid in fighting your enemies. However, the environments you'll be exploring do get much larger. Following on from the Lost Legacy small open world section, a fairly sizable chunk of Seattle is fully explorable here on horseback. But beyond that, areas do get pretty big, almost to an overwhelming degree, as I didn't want to miss any collectibles, supplements, safes, crafting items, or bullets, which are a lot harder to come by this go around. There's great variety in their visual designs too, with surprising imagination later on and some enjoyable environmental puzzles. However, I will admit that I did get lost as to where to go next regularly enough for it to be worth mentioning. It can be easy to miss small pathways in the darker areas. Besides that, exploration remains engrossing whether on foot, horse, or even a boat. The controls a bit wonky, but it's still fun. Oh, and Ellie finally got taught how to swim in between games, so that's cool. Spending time just looking around can also lead to interesting conversations and moments that are entirely possible to miss. They aren't essential, but they do increase the immersion factor quite a bit. A few times in the story you'll get to play the guitar, and one of these parts that's been mentioned a lot by others I didn't even see on my playthrough. Returning from the first game are those notes that further aid the world building, but this time what you can read might tell you about who some of the infected you fight were as people before they turned. It's really fascinating, and it adds a lot of weight to this universe with its optional nature, making it all the more rewarding. Speaking of the infected, they're not as prominent in the story, but you'll still encounter plenty of them lurking around with a couple of new stages of the virus included. First there's the Stalkers, which were apparently in the first game briefly, but they're much more prominent here. They hide and wait to ambush you, meaning that they don't come up in listen mode. A louder approach against them is advised. As long as the game doesn't freeze on you. Actually new here are the Shamblers, essentially the bloaters, but they spurt out a lethal gas that burns those who get too close to it. There is one more new type introduced, but that's a rather grisly surprise that you'll have to discover for yourself. And all the old types return too, so these encounters are still as intense as before. Actually, maybe even more intense. The underground hotel part in the original was the only part I found to be downright scary in that game. This has a few more of those bits where I found myself completely on edge and recoiling whenever they got too close. Not to mention a couple of really effective jump scares too, the kind you know is coming but it shocks you anyway. Part 2, if nothing else, is a much more effective horror than its predecessor. But it's your human rivals who prove to be the central challenge in the game. Just like before, you'll have to stealth through the enemy forces as much as possible, now with a few more options. Ellie can now crawl on all fours and hide in tall grass Metal Gear Solid style. Crafting returns with the new addition of a silencer for your pistol that breaks after 3 shots. Actually, upgrading your weapons has a bit more to offer with first-person targeting, an option for your guns, and giving the option to craft some more explosive ammunition. Naughty Dog wanted players to question their violent actions as they progressed through the game. Enemies will call out the names of their fallen allies, and the violence feels much grittier and visceral than before. The brutality of it all worked for me, but the idea of feeling guilty over your opponent's deaths didn't. I get what they were going for, but for one, some of these people are sadistic cult members doing things way worse than Ellie, so why should I feel regret about killing them? The other thing is the fighting wasn't envisioned to be fun. You're supposed to struggle with the grim murders you're committing. I didn't experience that. I was too busy being enthralled by the mechanical finesse. Sure, there's a couple of moments where you're forced to do some things you don't really want to, a unique feeling to say the least, but outside of that, the intended artistic merit of the gameplay didn't really impact me. But hey, I did say it was captivating, just not in the way the developers intended in correlation to the narrative. Sorry, Naughty Dog, it's just too thrilling a game to play to spend time questioning my moral integrity. By far the most impressive part about it is how flexible it is. You can approach the encounters in a myriad of different ways, yet it can just as easily evolve into a fight that pushes you to use all your skills. It feels so seamless the way you go from quietly sneaking about, making yourself known, to just flat out escaping if you're overwhelmed and lack the resources. Hell, if humans and infected are in the same area, you can cause a fuss and leave potential threats to fight amongst themselves while you hightail it out of there. It's the kind of unscripted gameplay that has you thinking on your feet, never quite having enough time to plan a strategy in the midst of things. Adding to that sense is the new addition of dogs that militia group the WLF have that can track your scent and will pounce as soon as you're spotted. True, these parts were tricky for me as a dog lover because I had to try really hard not to kill them. Oh God, I'm sorry. Oh, don't look at me, I already feel bad enough. When you are caught, the action comes thick and fast. Melee combat is as ferociously frantic as before, now with a dodge button that's especially useful against these big guys and the stalkers. Hand-to-hand only fights are also present here, and they're suitably scrappy affairs. Elsewhere, the gunplay still feels satisfying but reckless. Every bullet counts, and it's how low you wind up being with ammo that can really affect how you play. Having to rely on throwable items like the simple bricks and bottles, with the Molotov smoke bombs and the new trap mines proving equally as valuable to survival, not to mention deciding what to craft with your precious resources. There haven't been any radical changes made to the core gameplay outside of a few small additions, from taking damage from arrows to not needing to craft shivs as Ellie to fend off clickers, but the mechanics of the first game offered a gripping struggle of endurance as well as a sense of variety from the two different types of adversaries, and this is no different. There's little time for an intricately planned approach, meaning the gameplay is never predictable and always intense. Not to mention damn hard at times. Certain parts can really put you to the test, meaning that you'll have to experiment with different methods, usually trying to stay stealthier for longer helps, but yeah, you'll be given a really good challenge here and there. The Last of Us Part 2 doesn't mess too much with the formula from the first game. Instead, it expands the world with deeper exploration bonuses, multi-layered stages, and claustrophobic interiors for the infected to roam, along with extra traversal options and some solid Uncharted-esque set pieces on top of everything else. It's an experience that feels consistently varied and completely involving to play. But there is a big problem. A lot of what I've been praising here is mostly in direct correlation to the 11 hours worth of footage I captured for this video. The last bit of gameplay I recorded was the beginning of Abby's big section, which starts little over halfway, I think. So yeah, this is an incredibly lengthy experience of about 20 hours. An impressive runtime for sure, but therein lies my issue. It's far too long. I already discussed about how little impact the story beats in the midpoint of the game has, and because of that, the gameplay begins to suffer. It's mostly the narrative beats dragging things out, yet the game really takes the mickey piling on encounter after encounter that, because you just want to get back to playing as Ellie, start to feel like a nuisance. It doesn't help that the balancing between the enemy types isn't as smooth here. There's a large building you have to descend with nothing but infected to battle, and while it's still suspenseful, the sheer number of fights you have against them in this one part becomes a bit exhausting. Not that there aren't fun parts, it's still the same gripping gameplay, but it does bring the pacing down, and by the time it catches back up to Ellie, heck, even when you are playing as Ellie again, it felt like a different game to the one I started. Alright, this game put me in a difficult position when it came to reviewing it. As the credits rolled, I sat there with a million conflicted thoughts racing through my mind. I had no idea of what I thought of what I just played at the end there. But now I've had some time to process my opinions fully. As a complete whole, the first game is leaps and bounds better. Mechanically, the sequel is on par, but the original is overall a much tighter experience. It has a more focused tale, and it lasts long enough to satisfy as well as leaving you wanting more. Part 2 is lacking in that regard, with a really great first half somewhat sullied by a rather conflicted second, leaving my final verdict on the game being just very good. But hey, very good is still very good, and that's not even taking into account the impeccable presentation of the excellent acting, music, and unsurprisingly beautiful graphics. Its low points leave me hesitant to replay it, but I'll still be thinking about it for a long while. And I love entertainment like that. It's not just experience it and that's it. There's a ton to digest and debate no matter what you thought. So in the end, what we're left with is an ambitious, polarizing, sometimes disjointed, yet always overwhelming journey that, for better or worse, is going to be remembered and discussed for years to come.
Scale of 1 to 10. How would you rate our kiss from last night?
4.
4?
Yeah, why?
A 4.
Yeah.
You were at least an 8.
An 8?
You were a total 8.